With that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter Reidenbeck to continue our journey.
Thanks, Patrick. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is give you a kind of helicopter view of patient-level prediction. I'm going to start with giving our insights of the current state of the art, and I'm going to explain what we think we can contribute to the field. The second part of my presentation will be a case study where we're really going to do a prediction model, we're going to do a prediction problem on people with depression. So a clinician is confronted with prediction problems on a daily basis. So here in this cartoon you see a patient at the desk of a doctor. It's a patient who just got the diagnosis major depression. He actually looks a little bit sad for that reason. And he wants to know what his chance is of getting a stroke in the next year. So for the clinician, that's a difficult question to answer. He has a couple of options. He could just deny the ability to give a prediction and just say, sorry, I don't have enough information, I just cannot tell you what the chance will be that you will experience a stroke. In some situations, that might actually be a wise decision, just to say that you cannot give a prediction. But that's definitely not what the patient wants to hear. So another option the doctor has is refer back to the presentation of Patrick, where he could do data characterization and look at people who are about the same age, the same gender, and see in that group of people how many people would experience the stroke. Of course, that's not optimal, because those people might not be depressed patients. So a third option would be that he would refer to his own experience of people that he saw in his practice who looked like this specific patient, and he could try to do inference from that patient to this new patient in front of him. But that's of course a very difficult task to do, because he needs to keep in mind all the covariates of that specific patient, so the full history of that patient, and that's a very difficult thing to do. So in an ideal world, he would actually have a prediction model at hand that could help him give a better prediction. In this figure, you see the problem definition a little bit more clear. So what we want to do is we want to predict at a certain moment in time, t is 0, which in this case is the date of the major depression, and look back from that point in the history of the patient, take into consideration all the available data, and then predict the occurrence of an event, in this case a stroke, in the future. So there's a growing interest in doing prediction modeling. In the figure on the left, you see the strong increase in publications about this type of work. And on the right side, you see a Wordle that I made by doing a query in PubMed and annotating all the diseases that were in the titles of these different papers. So the nice thing here is that you see the frequency being depicted by the size of the word, and it shows you that there are diseases like heart failure and lung cancer that have been studied a lot in this field. But also depression and stroke are actually in this Wordle. They are small, but they are there, but they are probably not studied in relationship to each other. So there are models that are used in clinical practice as of today and already a while. And one of them is, for example, for stroke, the CHATS2 algorithm that's been developed for people with atrial fibrillation. It's a simple score where you just count, you have a count, you have to sum up the occurrence of certain events, and the total sum will give you an indication of the predictive value of the probability of getting a stroke. If we look at a study that followed after this one, a systematic review of all these methods, it was actually shown that the CHATS2 score did not replicate very well in other databases. And that's of course a big problem, because we want to apply that specific algorithm to all the databases that we have. So as a follow-up, of the CHATS2, the CHATS FAST was developed, which just included a couple of more covariates and was supposed to perform better in people with a low risk. So currently this algorithm, this simple counting algorithm, is the recommendation from the American Heart Association. But remember, this is a model that's been developed for people with atrial fibrillation. It doesn't mean that this model would apply to people with depression, and that's exactly the question that we want to answer now for this specific patient. So it means that we have to develop decision models, prediction models, in all the different cohorts at risk. If we look at in the literature, there are many reviews in different disease areas. So we see, for example, in cardiovascular disease, in a very recent review, that there are 800 models developed for that specific outcome. Also, stroke is in this list, so 83 models for stroke, but these are mainly for people who have stroke and then get another outcome. It's interesting to see that in those reviews, there are some common things that come back in all these conclusions, and that's the fact that many of these algorithms are built on a small number of variables. The size of the data sets that they are trained on, although they are getting bigger over the years, the median is about 26,000 people. And the most important thing, actually, that's also mentioned in this specific review from Goldstein, a very recent one of about a month ago, where they reviewed 107 studies. It was shown that only 26 of those 107 studies did external validation. So they did not, all these studies did not validate their prediction model on other databases. What's also shown in this review is that there might be things we can improve in the feature engineering side, in the sense that we might better use longitudinal data in our models, and that could maybe improve the performance. So in general, and as an overview on this slide, the conclusions of all these reviews that I showed earlier and the recent one a month ago, the problem is that with these prediction models, there's often inadequate even internal validation. So some of these models are published with only showing performance on the data set itself and not on any test set. They use small sets of features, so they might not use all the power that's in the electronic health record sufficiently. And another important problem is that many of those papers, although they give results, they don't share the models. So it's very hard to reproduce the study on your own data set. There's no transportability assessment, so the models are not evaluated on other data sets, which we believe is really a requirement for a good prediction model. The last issue is the impact on clinical decision making, and that's a very difficult thing to assess, but that's definitely some area that we need to go into to see what is really the effect of the prediction models on the patients. That's the ultimate goal, of course. It does mean that because of all these limitations, that relatively few prediction models are used in clinical practice today. So what we want to change is many of these points that I depicted in the previous slides. We want to contribute to the field by developing a systematic process to learn and evaluate large-scale patient-level prediction models using observational health data in a data network. We believe that we are very well equipped to move this field forward because we have standardized all our data sets to a common format. This would allow us to run, just like Patrick did with his data characterization work, it would allow us to run prediction models against a common structure, the common data model, very efficiently and in a standard way. So what I will be doing in the next couple of slides is go through all the steps of model development, some in a little bit more detail than others, but I will try to focus on these three elements that are on the slide here. So how do we generate the evidence? So how is the model building done and can we improve on that? How is it evaluated and how do we disseminate the results? So let's start, before we are even going to do data extraction, with saying that we need to pre-specify upfront what we want to do with our study. What type of model are we going to predict? What's the problem? So we need to define a study protocol upfront, which pre-specifies the planned analysis. The idea here is that we really want to make that public. We want to share the protocol from day one. In many of the studies that are published, this is actually not the case. We cannot look at the protocol, we don't know exactly how that's done, and I think that's really a deficiency. It's all about transparency. So we should be able to reproduce the study in all its details. So that means all the analysis code that's been used against the data source should be open source and should be shared. So we can run that same study on our own databases. The data extraction, of course, is an important step, and we can leverage there all the work that's been done in the last many years on standardizing to the own common data model, which is really great work. Because of that, we can create SQL queries against the data sources in a standardized way, and just distribute those queries over the different databases and get the same type of output. We believe that before doing that, and part of the whole modeling process, should be the data characterization step that Patrick talked about. Because it would give you insight on your table 1, and we believe it's important to know exactly what type of patients you have before you start doing that prediction problem. This might actually also trigger some data cleaning steps, where you want to remove, for example, outliers before even starting the model procedure. So the training of the model, and as we call it, internal validation, is normally done by splitting the data set into 2 sets, the training set and the test set. And that can be done in different ways. So one possibility could be to do a person split, where we randomly split the patients into, or select the patients and put them in the training set and the test set. Another possibility would be temporal validation, as we call it, where you actually divide in time. So you develop a model before 2014 and after 2014. We then use that time for evaluation or testing. In many of the studies, as I mentioned earlier, this is actually not done, or it's not clear how it's done, and we think this should be reproducible as well. So the model training, now we've pre-specified a problem, we extracted the data from the data set, we cleaned the data, we looked at the data characterization, and we split the data in the training test set, and the next step is really building the model. The question then is, which model are we gonna build? If we remember the slides from George with all the models, there are many models there, and we need to pick many of them actually to get insight in the full space and the full hyperplane that George shared with us. It's also important that we know how, and we have good procedures for evaluating these models in a standardized way. So thinking about the models, there are actually many models out there that we could use. Some of them are on the slide here, like regularized logistic regression, where we just make a linear combination of the features, and on top of that we add a penalty for the complexity of the model, which actually shrinks the model to a smaller set. So it does in fact do a kind of feature selection automatically. The other two, the random forest and the gradient boosting machines, are both tree learning algorithms where we develop small trees and try to combine all those small trees into a big classifier. The difference between the random forest and the gradient boosting machine is just the way we combine those trees and the way we train them. So in random forests, we randomly select over the features and over the patients and build for that subset of the data a tree, and repeat that process and then average like a majority vote over all the trees. In gradient boosting, the procedure is a little bit different. We also start with a small tree. We train the tree and we see how many, which patients actually are classified wrongly, and we use those as input for the next tree and combine those trees in the end. All the other models, some of them are here, might also be good candidates for this specific prediction problem. We don't know that up front. So we really think that model training itself is an empirical process where we want to compare multiple models while doing this work. So just summarizing that evidence generation component, we like to share the protocols, extract on a common structure, share all the code, and we do proper internal validation on all the models that we want to develop. These things might seem quite understandable, probably everybody does that, but it's actually not the case. I think we can really improve this area, this evidence generation component, by creating standardized tools on top of our common structures. So now we build a model, but how good is the model actually performing? So we enter into the area of evidence evaluation. In general, for prediction models, there are two criteria that we look at. The first thing is discrimination. So how well are we able to discriminate the cases from the non-cases? And we ideally want to have a model that predicts high probabilities for those with the event compared to those without the event. I will go into that a little bit more in the next slides. Calibration is the other component where we try to compare the estimated probability with the observed frequency, and we want both to be very close to each other, of course. So discrimination, how do we assess discrimination? I'm going to explain you one of the methods, or one of the measures that we use for that, which is the area under the ROC curve. For some of you that might be a well-known thing, but I'm also quite sure there are people in the room who don't really know how you come to that specific measure. So I'm going to explain that in two of the upcoming slides. So let's take a very simple model. Let's say the model is simply BMI above a certain threshold. And suppose we want to distinguish two classes, the blue and the red, the 0 and the 1, and each of them have their own probability distribution of BMI. So what you see in the figure here is actually that the red class has a higher frequency of the higher values of BMI compared to the blue one. The sensitivity and specificity of our algorithm is completely dependent on the threshold that we pick, the vertical line here. So if we would create a simple 2x2 table where we have vertically the observed numbers and horizontally the predicted values, it will mean that if we look at the true positives, this would simply be the number of cases above the threshold that are actually a case. And the other way around, the true negatives are the ones that we correctly classify as negative. We also make errors, because you see there's overlap between the two distributions. So we have false negatives and false positives. So how does this help us? Well, we can calculate the true positive rate and the false positive rate, and this is actually the only formula in my presentation, and I think it's a simple one. We just divide the total, the true positives divided by the total number of positives, which is true positives plus false negatives. And for false positive rate, it's just the other way around. So it's the ones that we incorrectly classify as positive divided by the others. So what you do with this is you can plot both variables against each other, and you get a so-called ROC curve. Many people have heard of the name ROC, but it actually stands for Receiver Operator Curve, and it originates from the Second World War, where there were radar images, and the radar operators, that's where the name operator comes from, had to decide whether a blip on the screen represents an enemy target or a friendly ship, or it's just noise. So it's nice here that they use this just to define where is the threshold on the screen to say it's an enemy or not. And we still use that concept in our prediction work. So you see here on the left the two distributions, and on the right the ROC curve, and the dot is actually the position that we are now with this specific position of the threshold. So if we now going to move the line in the figure, we're actually going to move over. There it goes. It's going to move over the ROC curve, because we take different positions on that. And you can see that by moving the line, we just simply move over the ROC curve. We cannot change the complete area under the curve, which is the one that we really like to optimize. If we would now have distributions that would overlap more, it's more difficult to separate the two classes. And you see what happens here is that because they are overlapping, the area under the curve is going down, so we cannot get to the one point up in the upper left side. In the ultimate case, where both distributions would overlap, we would actually not be able to distinguish the classes at all, and we would move over the diagonal. So the goal is that we make this graph, these two distributions, as separable as possible. And we can do that by making good prediction models. And we will be using the area under the curve as one of the important measures in the study that we will share later on. The other parameter that we look at is calibration. Here we have on the x-axis the average predicted probability, and on the y-axis we have the fraction of people with the outcome. Ideally, we want our probabilities on the diagonal line, and you see here it's actually a little bit below, which means it's an overestimation of the probability. So we use these measures for our internal validation, but we definitely want to do external validation. We want to see how good the model performs on other data sets. And that's a step we can do very well in the Odyssey community because we have standardized our data model. So we're definitely going to do that. And one of the one of the points that I want to make in our proof of concept study is that we actually show results of exactly this exercise. So for evidence evaluation, what we want to apply is really a standardized process for doing this. Every model that we will develop will have the same type of evaluation measures, the same graphs. It's a full stack of results, and this was only a part of it actually. So we're going to share discrimination, calibration, and external validation should really be the standard of doing prediction modeling work. It's not an option. You should only publish a paper if you have done that step. At least that's what we believe. Evidence dissemination is then, I think it's about two things. It's on the first place, how are we going to publish our results? But the other thing is how are we going to share the models? So for publishing the results, there has been done a lot of work in Europe in the so-called tripod statement, which stands for transparent reporting of multivariable prediction models for individual prognosis or diagnosis. And within our patient error prediction workgroup, which started as of this year, beginning of this year, we had some very good discussions with all the people, and we're actually quite convinced that the statements that are in that paper are a good starting point for our work. That means that internal and external validation should always be reported on in the paper. But another very important point about dissemination is not only the publication, because that's a static thing, we should also share our models themselves. Because we want to extend our research to other databases, so we need to find a way to share models in an open source environment, for example on a website, and that would allow us to completely reproduce the study on another set, including code and all that other stuff. So now we have the story, the helicopter view that I promised you to give on building models, extracting models, building models, evaluating models. Well, the next part of my presentation, I think is even more interesting, is about large-scale prediction in patients with depression. So why did we want to do this study? First of all, we want to assess the feasibility of doing large-scale predictive modeling. And large-scale meaning taking all the covariates in the history of the patient into consideration. We also want to investigate the performance of the different classifiers across the outcomes, but also across the databases that we had access to in this specific study. The whole idea of this is to initiate a Odyssey-wide study as of tomorrow, because we shared all the code for this on the Odyssey website and the protocol. So the problem definition in this case is it's the same figure that you saw in the beginning, but I filled in the details now for this proof of concept study. We want to study among patients in 4 different databases, and we want to aim to develop prediction models to predict which patients are at a defined moment in time, which in this case, first pharmaceutically treated depression event, will experience 1 out of the 22 different outcomes during a time at risk of 1 year. And for the prediction in this case, we use all the demographics, conditions and drug use prior to that moment in time. The at-risk cohort has the following inclusion criteria. We say we want at least a year of history and a year of follow-up for the prediction or the occurrence of the outcome. There should not be any occurrence of the event prior to the index date. So we really look at new events occurring after that T is 0. So the setting here is we have all those 22 outcomes. Those are the same that Patrick mentioned in his presentation. We have 4 databases and we created cohorts on these databases. Look at the numbers. They are actually pretty big. We have big sizes, a very large population. And we do the extraction of demographics, conditions and drugs, and we do a temporal split for training and testing. The models we're going to train, we trained and I'm going to show you results of, is the gradient boosting, random forest, and the regularized regression that I introduced earlier in my talk. You can imagine that this is a very large amount of data to represent. We have 22 outcomes, we have 3 algorithms, we have 4 databases, so that's a very big amount of data. So I'm going to focus first on one outcome, which is stroke, and then I'm going to zoom out to the others to give you insight in that as well. So if we look at just the biggest data set, which is CCAE, and we looked at regularized regression, these are actually the result that we get for that specific algorithm. So this is only one algorithm out of the 4 on one of the databases on one outcome. So it's one tiny dot in that big space that I'm going to show you later on. So the area under the curve is quite high. It's 80%. We see that as a good model. Of course, the doctor does not want to communicate an area under the curve to the patient. He doesn't understand what that is. He needs to make a choice. He needs to select a threshold, and that's why I put a little bit more time in explaining that area under the curve in the animation, where you saw that by moving that threshold in those 2 distributions, we could move over the ROC curve and pick a specific point that we think is good in the context of the current question. So if the physician would like to have a sensitivity of 25%, meaning that he finds 25% of the positive cases, and allows 3% of error, he needs to take a threshold of 1% in this, for this specific model. It means that he says if the probability is higher than 1%, we say it's stroke, and if it's below, it's not. On the right side, we see the calibration plot. It's the same plot that I showed you earlier. But you see here that the calibration of this model, it's a little down. It's a little bit overestimating the probability. So it's giving a higher predictive probability than the real fraction. It's not 1. You want to have it 1, but it's at least not very, very bad. And we actually could recalibrate the models if we want to. I'll not go into that, but that's an option that you could actually try. If we now go to the model itself, so the question is, we have a model, it's nice, we have some regularized regression model, but what's in the model? Which parameters are in the model? Because that could actually help us to understand better the components of it. And as a reminder, I'd like to give you here the background of the FAST2 score again, which was designed for atrial fibrillation to predict stroke, not for patients with depression, and not for incident stroke. So it's a related area, but it's not exactly the same problem that we try to solve here. The variables in that score were age, gender, heart failure, hypertension, diabetes, and vascular disease. The question now is, did our model also find these parameters that were found for the vascular score, were actually found, they were suggested by experts, but are we able to, by a data-driven approach, are we able to find those same parameters? I'm going to share you a plot that you might not have seen before. This shows on the x-axis the prevalence of the covariates in people without the outcome, and on the y-axis the prevalence of the features, the covariates for people with the outcome. So it means that all the dots that will be on the lower right side are more prevalent in patients without the outcome, and on the top left side is more prevalent in patients with the outcome. If we look at just a couple of the variables that we selected in the model, and these are the ones that are part of the vascular score. And we see here, it's very small for you to see in the back, we see here, for example, hypertension automatically picked up by the algorithm. So it's more prevalent in patients with the outcome than without the outcome, because it's actually on the upper left side. But the other parameters that were in the model are also found automatically, like diabetes, age, statin use, etc. And there's one here on the other side, it's also age, but that's actually when you're young. It's actually more frequent in people without the outcome. These are just the ones that were in the FAST score, but we did an automatic approach, so we found many more variables that were also predictive. So in this plot, you see all the variables that we put in the model, the full history of the patient. You see here still the ones that were part of the vascular score, but we see many others. For example, we have here information about tobacco, and it makes sense actually that smoking might have an impact on the occurrence of stroke, headache, anti-epileptics, etc. What's also shown in this figure is the size of the beta, and that's the size of the dot. So the bigger the dot, the higher the impact is of that specific variable in the model. The color shows you whether it's positive or negative beta. And you see that most of the positive betas are on the upper left side. We think that showing these kinds of plots is very informative and should just be part of the pipeline. And because we made all these tools in an open source approach, you can just run this on your model and on the model that you created. And I think that's really a very, very nice thing to have. So concluding here is that from the 17,000 variables that were in the model, we picked automatically 247. Those contained all the CHATS2 variables, plus some other variables that make clinical sense, like brain cancer, smoking. But there are also other variables, of course, that warrant further exploration, like, for example, the anti-epileptic drug or COPD. But at least we make this very transparent, and we show that very well now in the models that we predict. Let's go to the stroke and look at discrimination. So in this plot, you see 4 panels, and those are the 4 different databases. So on the top panel, we see CCAE, then MDCD, MDCR, and the Optum database. And within each panel, we show the results of the different algorithms. So we have the boosting, the random forest, and the regularized regression on individual rows within the panels. The columns are the diseases, and I show here the results of stroke. And the color in the heat map gives you information about the area under the curve. Ideally, we would like to have them all blue, but that's not going to happen, I'm afraid. But there are, a lot of them are green, meaning that they are above 80% area under the curve, which is a very good thing. We also see that in MDCR the performance is worse, and I'll get back to that. If we would now zoom out to all the outcomes, so this is only one outcome, which is normally one paper that we write. If we zoom out, we see this nice picture, colorful picture, where we have in each of the cells the algorithm, the data set, and the indication of the area under the curve. If we zoom in a little bit in some of the interesting aspects, we see here, for example, the results on the MDCR database, which is lower than all the other databases. We think that the reason for that might be that this is an older population, a sicker population, where it's more difficult to discriminate between the cases and the non-cases. We see also that there are some outcomes that we are able to predict a lot better than others. So we see that AMI we can do very well in most of the databases, and stroke and hypothyroidism, but we cannot do diarrhea and nausea very well, which is not really surprising, because there might be many reasons for getting a diarrhea. I can tell you that. So another thing is that if we would look at only the ones that are above 75%, we see this plot, and we see that more than half of the outcomes we can get prediction models that have quite acceptable AUC. The best one we could predict in this specific data set was on CCAE, where we used regularized regression and found a model that had an AUC of almost 90%, which is really very good. So how is it, what can we say about the models? Which model is better than the other one? I think in general there is not a lot of difference between these models. They all have about the same value, they are in the green area. However, there are some of them where we actually see differences between the models. So gradient boosting is doing here really better than the other two algorithms. It's interesting to understand why that actually is the case. What's the reason for that? It might be just a feature engineering problem, that there might be some interactions that we need to model better, but there might also be other reasons that we are not aware of. I think this is actually an interesting research area to figure out why one model does better than the other one. And that might be something we can put on the agenda of our working group. So we look now at a lot of data, and remember, each of these cells is actually a publication. We could write a publication on each of those outcomes within the depressed patient group, all over all the different data sets, which is already very nice for one publication. But we also want to do transportability assessment. So we want to know, if we develop a model on one database, how well does that specific model perform on another set? So in this figure, you see that again. If we train on CCAE and we apply that specific model on the other three databases, how well do we perform when we look at the AUC and also calibration if we want to? So this is shown in this figure. But let me explain that a little bit. So you see here on the left, you see the databases, and those are the databases that we use for the training. And in the columns, you see the databases that we use for the testing or the validation. So it means that in the upper left corner, we see CCAE against CCAE, so that's the training against the test set in that specific data set. On the other databases, it's just on that specific data set. So it's really an external validation there. So what do we see in this figure? Transportability to the MDCR data set is low. It's not really surprising, because we cannot predict very well on the data set itself. So by using the training set and the test set, we get quite a low, it's like 66% AUC, which is not very high. It would be very strange if we could develop a model on another data set that would perform better than the model developed on the database itself. So this is not a surprising finding. It's still interesting to figure out why we are not able to develop models very well in this specific data set. Maybe the data characterization could help with that. What we also see is that, in general, a lot of the models are transportable, and they transport quite well. So between CCAE and Optim and other databases, that's actually quite nice. So what did we achieve so far with all the work that we've been doing? I think that by the software that we've created, and I've not talked about the software, but it's an amazing piece of work mainly done by Jenna Reps, who's also here in the room. What we've done by doing that, by creating that piece of software, is that we have a standardized pipeline for doing proper validation internally. We allow and we enable to do a full data-driven approach, so we can use all the data that's in the medical record, in the common data model, for our prediction work. And we can assess the transportability of the models because of our standardization. That's just a prerequisite for doing any type of study, we think, within the Odyssey network. What's still difficult, and something we have to think about, and actually we might need help from people in the room here, is how to assess the clinical, the impact of the models. And that's actually an interesting area for future research, we believe. I think the most important thing that we've learned from the exercise is that it's feasible to do large-scale predictive modeling using databases that are converted to the common data model. And we can actually do this now for any cohort at risk, any outcome, and any time at risk. So this is just only in patients with a depression. But we can use all the cohort definitions that Patrick showed in his presentation and do the same thing again automatically. It will take time to run. It's not always fast, but it should not be the bottleneck. It just means we have to buy more computers. But we can do this, I think, and I'm sure we're going to show a very nice results of it. You can imagine that you would have like a Google Earth image where you can just zoom in to all the different disease areas and get those nice colorful pictures that I showed you, the heat maps, for all the diseases in that specific area of interest. I think that would be awesome, actually. So how do we think we want to move on our journey? So we definitely want to increase the number of databases. Personally, because I'm from the Netherlands, I really think we should extend to Europe and see how well these models transport to completely different settings. And we have our own database in Rotterdam, where I'm from. And I would be very interested to repeat that study there and see how much difference we get. Can we transport a model developed on a claims database in the US to a GP database in the Netherlands? We want to increase the number of cohorts of risk, as I mentioned, maybe even go to that kind of zoom-in approach. And also we want to increase the number of outcomes. So we just want to expand in all directions. I also think that there is still a lot of work to do. We just created a backbone for doing this work. But we have to look at ways to improve the performance, maybe develop better methods to do that, look at other features. We might want to improve on speed, and I think we can do that. We have the right people in the room for doing that. We might want to develop methods to optimize not for the area under the curve, but for transportability. So how can we make a model that's better transportable? That's a different question and might require different methods. Personally, I'm very interested in also the temporal information. So how can we leverage the temporal information in the record? Currently, we don't use that very optimal, I think. There are methods out there, and we definitely want to extend our tool set with models and methods for incorporating temporal information. The last point, well, it's not the last point, there are probably many more things that we want to study, but an important point is leveraging the textual information that's in the record. And we don't really do that because we use the codes, but I think there's a lot of information in the text as well. And we have a very good working group here that's working on textual, on text mining. And I can't wait to get results from that group so we can incorporate that in our prediction work. That would be very nice to do. The last point, how to assess the impact for the patient, is also something that, well, as I mentioned earlier, we've got to work on and get answers to that. So for all of this work, we really need you. And I think there's a lot of brain power here in this room, and we need people from different disciplines. So we need clinicians, because we want to understand the data. I'm not a clinician, but we need to have those people on board as well to understand what we are actually finding. They could help us explain the covariates that we show in that nice plots with all the dots. We want you to join the study. If you have a data set, please do contact me or join the reps to join our large-scale patient prediction study, which is just a pilot, but we want to extend that to many more outcomes and many more cohorts at risk. And please also, if you're interested, please join the patient-level prediction work group. We started that from the beginning of the year, and I'm very happy with the amount of interest that we got in this group. It's really amazing. It's a big list of people that are active in our group. And also from outside the US, there's a lot of interest in the work that we are doing, also in Europe, where I'm from. People are really following the work and want to join. So if you're interested, please contact me and we'll add you to the list. That would be great. Finally, so there is a demo. It's a nice animation. There's a demo in the afternoon of the package, and Jenna is going to give that. So please go and have a look at that. We also have posters. The only thing that I want to recommend you is do stop at our posters, because these people actually, they walk on all the time. And we want you to stop at the posters. That's my final thing. And then, of course, please join the journey. Thank you very much.